Well, good afternoon. I'm Jason Gourmet, the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Real pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, Reflections on 9/11 and Threats to the Homeland. We find ourselves in a pretty profound inflection point at this moment. I think, as most people are aware, in 10 days, we will honor the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy, which took the lives of 2,997 Americans and I think changed our nation in many significant ways. And we are honored to have two BPC stalwarts, Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, with us here today for an initial discussion, both thinking back to their own experiences, but also what it means for the nation. Also, as everybody knows, yesterday, the United States ended its military presence in Afghanistan, which raises critical questions about the changing threat environment, which are only compounded by the increased domestic radicalization that our nation is grappling with. And just delighted Susan Page will be leading a discussion with Secretary Jay Johnson and Phil Zelico, who can share some thoughts about where this process takes us going forwards. The Bipartisan Policy Center's efforts here really began over a decade ago when Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton, the chairs of the 9/11 Commission, came to BPC and led a series of discussion groups and recommendations and papers trying to advance the core findings of the 9/11 Commission. And I am reminded by today's events that much of our work focused on the fact that there were really two types of recommendations in that commission report. The first were really focused on locating, identifying, and disrupting terrorist networks and people who wished us ill. And by all accounts, we've done a pretty remarkable job of that. I think most people in the days and months following 9/11 felt like it was almost a certainty that there would be more massive attacks. And I think we deserve a tremendous amount of credit. The intelligence community deserves a tremendous amount of credit for protecting the homeland. But the second category of recommendations was focused on trying to understand, identify, and address the core forces of radicalization that are motivating the hatred and the violence. And I think an assessment of the last 20 years, and particularly the last few weeks, demonstrate that we're doing a pretty bleak job at that. And so I am delighted to introduce my colleague, BPC's head of communications, Steve Scully, with that constructive tension, and ask you to take over the conversation. I will just note that people should raise questions on the live chat through YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live. Thank you so much. Over to you, Steve.
Jason, thank you. And this is an important and timely conversation. Let me at the outset introduce our guests. For the first half of the program, both of our guests, two senators, served as the leaders of their party and both affiliated with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Senator Tom Daschle serving 4 years in the House of Representatives, and later 3 terms in the U.S. Senate representing South Dakota. He is one of the co-founders of BPC. Senator Trent Lott spent 7 terms in the House of Representatives, 18 years in the U.S. Senate representing the state of Mississippi, becoming the Republican leader. He's a senior fellow here at BPC, and as he pointed out earlier, he also spent 4 years as a congressional staffer, so in total, nearly 40 years in Congress. Susan Page is going to be moderating the second half of the discussion, as Jason indicated, really to get a sense of the threats that we're facing today. She is, of course, no stranger to Washington, D.C. She serves as the bureau chief, the Washington bureau chief of USA Today. She is a frequent contributor on a number of cable networks, the author of 2 best-selling books, including her latest on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and now working on a new book, a biography of Barbara Walters. So Susan Page, thank you for joining this conversation. And for that half of the conversation, we are pleased to welcome the former Homeland Security Secretary during the Obama administration, Secretary Jay Johnson. He serves on a number of boards, including the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. In 2018, he received the Ronald Reagan Peace Through Strength Award. And one other biographical note, he served as an intern in Senator Pat Moynihan's office back in 1978. So that probably set him up well in his years in public service. And finally, Philip Zelico is the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. He served as a counselor in the State Department under Secretary of State Condi Rice during the George W. Bush administration. He has authored or co-authored a number of books, including To Build a Better World, Choices to End the Cold War and Create a Global Commonwealth, co-authored with Secretary of State Condi Rice, and served as a member of the White House Intelligence Advisory Board under both President Bush and President Obama. He's also a history professor at UVA. So to all of you, thank you for being with us. We want to begin first with the day, September 11th, 2001. Senator Tom Daschle, as that Tuesday morning unfolded, what do you remember?
Steve, first of all, thank you and Jason and the VPC for this program. I think it's a very timely and extremely important discussion. I remember the day vividly. It's rare that anyone can remember with such certainty and specificity the moments that occurred on a particular day, but I remember that day as if it happened just yesterday. I was sitting in my office early that day and preparing for a leadership meeting. We always had leadership meetings Tuesday mornings. John Glenn was in my office just to have a cup of coffee before he did an interview, I think with CNN or C-SPAN that morning. And as we sat there, I had my monitor on and I saw this incredible sight of a plane going into the World Trade Center. And I commented to John, I said, my goodness, did you see that? A pilot just flew into the World Trade Center. And his first reaction, I'll never forget, is that was no pilot. We went on into the leadership meeting and we had just started. And soon after that, I remember Senator Patty Murray looked out the window and saw this big black billowing cloud out of the window. And she said, my God, something's on fire. So we all rushed to the window and we could barely see it, but right over the Pentagon, there was this big cloud of smoke and a plane had just hit the Pentagon. Right about that time, our security details rushed into the room and physically demanded we leave the building and run as fast as we can because we had heard that another plane was going to hit the Capitol at any moment. I can recall literally running out with my other fellow leaders, and I can remember seeing Senator Byrd, who was then in his late 70s, early 80s, carrying two heavy armfuls of books, running out himself out of the building. The amazing thing is we had no idea where we were running. We were just running out of the building. We had no place to go. And because we didn't know where we were going, our detail all decided to take us to the Capitol Police headquarters, which is a 4-story building about a block away. We took the stairs up to the 4th floor and they pulled down the shades. And because nobody's cell phones was working, most of us didn't even have cell phones at the time. We all stood in line to use the one hard line. That is, we all, I mean, the leadership, both Republican and Democratic. So I was going to try to call my wife, Linda. And then it was decided that we'd make a statement. And so we issued a very short statement. And then we were told to leave, but we could go someplace secure. We had no idea where that was. So we all did our own thing. I went to my political office a few blocks away. It was there that I was told to report back to the west front of the Capitol building where the inaugurations take place, to take a helicopter to the secret undisclosed location. I did that, and as I was taking off, I heard somebody ask the pilot whether they had room to pick up Senator Lott at Andrews Air Force Base. So we helicoptered to Andrews, went out to the secret undisclosed location, flew right over the Pentagon, seeing this plane halfway into the building with hundreds and hundreds of firemen and scores of fire trucks. We got to this undisclosed location. I still don't know precisely where it was. And so we're there for a while. We talked to the president, the vice president, talked to a lot of our colleagues who were just as concerned and anxious. And I know Trent and I both felt the same way. We felt it was just odd that we were in that safe and secure place while our families and our other colleagues and our staff and everybody else was in Washington. So I remember Trent and I both demanded that we be taken back to Washington. So I think it was around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. We did that. We came back and we decided we'd make a statement that Congress was going to come back into session the next day. We decided to make that statement on the Capitol steps. We thought it was just going to be a handful of leaders. As it turns out, more than 100 people, 100 members of Congress gathered on the steps, stood behind us as Speaker Hastert, who was then the Speaker of the House, and I made a statement. And then somebody just spontaneously began singing God Bless America. We all held hands. The thing I remember the most about that day is within hours, everybody declared themselves not Republican, not Democratic, but Americans. And it was probably as unified as I think our country has probably ever been, at least since World War II. It was an inspirational moment, a very tense, anxious time. We really had no idea how much peril there still remained, but we were pleased to know, thanks to the heroic efforts of people on the plane over Pennsylvania, that plane that was supposed to hit the Capitol crash landed as a result of their efforts. But I had a remarkable partner through all that in Trent Lott, and it's a day I'll never forget.
And I want to come back to that moment of bipartisanship. This, by the way, is also the first time the two of you have spoken together about the events of 9/11 in a program focusing on September 11th. So Senator Lott, let me turn to you as that day unfolded. As you hear Senator Daschle, what do you remember?
Well, first, Steve, I want to thank you for doing this. I remember we've had events together many times at C-SPAN over the years. So thank you, and thank Bipartisan Policy Center for doing this. And Susan Page, thank you for joining in. Yes, it's an event that is etched indelibly in my mind too. That day is one that I will always remember. And I agree with Tom about so much about what happened, but I was in my office sometime before 9 o'clock, and I remember about 9:15, a staff person came in and said, hey, turn your TV on, something has just happened at the World Trade Center. And I turned it on, and there it was. And shortly after that, I had concerns about this other plane that was in the air. And so I picked up the red phone on my desk, which only rings on Tom Daschle's desk at the time, to say, I think we need to get out of here. We're probably next. And as Tom noted, about that time, our security detail came in and said, we got to get out of here. And I said, I got to get my briefcase. And they said, no, leave it. But I got my briefcase anyway. And as Tom noted, we went across the street, not a very safe place. My security detail said, in fact, the head of my detail was an Air Force guy, retired. He said, let's go to Andrews Air Force Base. So I went down, and we got in the car and went to Andrews Air Force Base, where I had access to phone and food, and I didn't know how long I was going to be there. And then I got the call that Tom Daschle was coming in a helicopter to pick me up, and he did, and we took off. And I still think about the moment I saw the Pentagon and the smoke billowing up as we flew to an undisclosed location, a cavern somewhere out north and west of Washington. I still don't know whether we were in West Virginia or Maryland, but we went underground when we got there. We did have communication. And as Tom noted, after a while, we really felt an urge to get back and to be with our families and our colleagues in the Congress. And so I talked to Dick Cheney, actually, to send the helicopter to pick us up. And initially he said no. And so then I called my security detail and said, come get me. But shortly thereafter, we got another call. The helicopter was going to come get us. We landed on the west front of the Capitol. And as Tom noted, we went around and we're on the east side, the front of the north side of the Capitol, and had this, opportunity to say we were going to be in session the next day. And then this spontaneous, unprompted, God bless America, which I'll always just appreciate so much. I don't know who started it or why, but it was a memorable day, and one that I think, quite frankly, helped to bond Tom Daschle and me, not just as co-leaders, but as friends and people that want to do something right for our country. And in the months after that, we worked in a totally bipartisan way. And I think the record would show that the approval rating of the Senate in particular by December of that year was probably the highest it's ever been, just showing that you can get things done in a bipartisan way. And the people do appreciate it. So it was quite a day that I will never forget, one that shall live in infamy.
Senator Daschle, at what point during the flurry of events and the emotion that you were going through did you realize the gravity of what that day represented?
Well, I think almost immediately, Steve, because of the magnitude of the problem. We could just to see the horrific sight of people jumping out of windows hundreds of stories high, and two planes crashing into the World Trade Center, and all the chaos in New York, and then to fly over the Pentagon and to see that half buried airplane into the Pentagon on the north side, and just all of that occurring so quickly and so just overwhelmingly. I think the real question was not the gravity of the circumstances that we understood. It's just how to address that gravity because it had never happened before. And trying to figure out, where do we go? What do we do? How do we respond? And how can we provide the kind of leadership that is so necessary in a crisis like that?
And part of addressing that was, as you pointed out, Senator Lott, to make sure that Congress was back in session the following day. Give us a sense of your conversations with the White House, President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and others.
Well, most of my conversations that day, 9/11, and right after were with Cheney, but I did subsequently have conversations with President Bush. And Tom and I have talked about the fact that for weeks, maybe months after that, every Tuesday, we would have breakfast at the White House with the president, 7 a.m. And it would be Tom and Dick Gephardt and Denny Hastert and I, and we sometime had a briefing with the CIA, sometime Cheney was there, sometime not. But we appreciated the fact that the president had that meeting with us, bipartisan meeting, almost every week. And quite often he would go around the world talking about what was happening and what our allies were doing and what our commitments were. It's the kind of thing that I don't think happens much anymore. But it was so important that you have communication between the president of the United States and the leaders of Congress. If you don't talk, you're not listening, you're probably not learning. Also, right after that, I think it's important to note that Tom and I and other leaders went up by train to New York City and went to the site and had a press conference afterward in which we said, when they hit New York City, they hit America. And we're here to tell you, we're going to be here for you. And we went to work in a bipartisan way. I mean, I remember conversations with Chuck Schumer and at Aftermath and Hillary Clinton. And the Congress did do what was necessary, not just militarily in the aftermath, but also on a personal and human basis to help New York City and our country. We were all hit that day. But that was an important trip that Tom and I took up to New York, I guess a couple of weeks after 9/11.
So, Senator, let's stay with you, because you and Senator Daschle have both touched on the theme of the bipartisanship that we saw 20 years ago. Was our politics different back then? What's changed in 20 years?
Oh, everything. The people are different. The times are different. The media is different. You know, we didn't have as much of the 24/7 around the clock media or social media. You know, I'm not much one to participate in social media because I just can't believe some of the things that people say and do in the social media. But so the media was different. The people were different. The times are different. Tom and I talk a lot about, you know, what we experienced and what we think maybe we need more of now. We're not trying to say, well, look at us. We went through some difficult times. We got through them well. But we talked in our book, Crisis Point, about what is missing. And number one is communication. If leaders in the Congress, both parties, both bodies of Congress, and the presidents need to communicate and talk about where can you find common ground? How can you get things done? But a lot of it is, you know, Tom and I had an easy relationship. I could talk to him. I trusted him. I respected him as the leader of the other party. And sometime, you know, one of my Republican colleagues would get a little carried away and try to block something Tom was trying to do. And I remember one time specifically talking to John McCain saying, John, you can't do that. You can't put a hold on the Democratic leaders' bill. And he said, no, you're probably right. You let it go. So I think that's missing now. You know, I don't know how much Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell talk. I suspect it's pretty difficult, but it really needs to occur. And also, you need to communicate across the Capitol. I used to have regular meetings with Dick Armey, who was the whip over in the Senate, and with Newt Gingrich about what we could do or not do. Because I realized that quite often legislation that would come over from the House was like ships passing in the night. I didn't know it was coming over, and I didn't pay any attention to it unless we were able to talk about what they were doing, what we were doing, and then make it come together.
Senator Daschle, it was a 50-50 Senate in 2001. It is a 50-50 Senate today. Could Senators McConnell and Schumer have the same type of relationship that you had with Senator Lott?
Well, that's a good question, Steve. I think Trent has just said it so well. There's little I can add to how much things have changed, but clearly things have changed, and it's affected relationships. It's affected the degree to which the Congress can act. I believe, unfortunately, the Congress has gotten increasingly dysfunctional, in part because they don't have the relationships that we were fortunate enough to build when we were there. And as Trent said, we certainly don't want to say do what we did. Things are different. But I would start with simply doing as much as possible to creating an environment for better communication, better relationship building. Without a good relationship, there can be no trust. Without trust, there can be no negotiation. Without negotiation, there can be no progress. And that's unfortunately what we're facing a lot today. I'm very hopeful we can get this infrastructure legislation passed. It's a demonstration of what happens when there is that return to bipartisanship and cooperation. But there just has to be a lot of recognition that as times change, we have to change with them in a way to accommodate that change and create the kind of mechanisms necessary to make our government functional again.
Senator Lott, can we get there, to Senator Daschle's point?
Yes, we can. And we talk about that in our book too. And the answer is one word: leadership. It takes a president that is willing to make an extra effort to listen to and talk to the Congress, both parties. In fact, I love the story or the suggestion that Tom has about how President Biden should get the bipartisan leadership up to Camp David and just have a good discussion. But the leadership, it begins at the White House, but it also applies to Congress, particularly the Senate. I found out the hard way sometime. Anytime you get a woman senator and a male senator or two or three senators together, they can tie the place up or they can make it move. And we had different gangs, the gang of five and so forth. But one or two men or women in the Senate, preferably one of each party at least, would say, hey, we're not going to keep doing this. We're going to find a way to do an infrastructure bill. We're going to find a way to deal with how we can better get ourselves in a position to compete with the challenges from China. But leadership is the word. People have to make up their minds. We're not going to stay on this path. We're going to find a way to make a difference for our country.
But Senator Daschle, as you well know, often the problem when it comes to any of these issues are the problems that you face within your own party, whether from progressives and moderate Democrats or conservative and what's left of any moderate Republicans for Senator Lott. Can you address that?
No, I think that's right. I think it's really critical to create the kind of unity. But it's, what I worry a little bit about these days is that the constant battle now is to win back the majority if you're in the minority, or to keep the majority if you're in the majority. And if with a 50-50 Senate, I think it creates an environment, this competitive notion that somehow we've got to do whatever we can to advantage ourselves politically for the next election has really created obstacles for that cooperation and for that functional aspect that we're so yearning for today. We can't do anything that will somehow advantage the other side. Conferences now, caucus meetings, oftentimes turn into pep rallies. There's very little opportunity for caucuses to join together. That's another thing that came out of 9/11 and the anthrax attack in my office just a few weeks later, is the amount of joint caucus time that we had. And I think that created a sense of unity as well. If you can break bread with somebody on the other side, chances are you're going to talk to them on the floor as well, or her on the floor. And I don't think enough of that happens these days. So creating that environment for better communication, whether it's within the caucus or with the other side, is so critical.
In just a moment.
Steve, if
go
I
ahead,
could
Senator Lott.
pick up, I was whipping the House all during the Reagan years, 8 years, and was whipping the Senate 2 different times. And this is one example of why it's more difficult. Used to, there was a center. And when I was whipping the House, I had 30, 40 Democrats that I could go to on Reagan's defense issues or budget issues. There was a center. And then over In the Senate, we had moderate Republicans. You know, I was always right of center, but so I had to keep an eye on Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania and the ladies from Maine. And so we had moderates and we had conservatives in the House. Now there's not much of a center. Both parties have moved one way or the other, and the middle is just hard to get into. In fact, Tom and I, when we would negotiate, quite often, you know, he would start a little bit left of center, I'd start right of center, and we'd start talking and working until we found the sweet spot. Sometime it was a little bit more in his direction, sometime mine. That is not happening now, and that's what we're missing.
In just a moment, I'm going to turn to Susan Page, who will continue the conversation with two experts on the homeland and what we're facing today. But I know both Senator Daschle and Lott will stay with us for the end of the program for some final comments. But let me just go back to that late afternoon, early evening on the steps of the Capitol, that moment of bipartisanship during our darkest hour, the attacks on 9/11. Senator Lott, I'll begin with you. What was going through your mind that moment?
Well, concern and fear and thinking about what we were going to do. But I thought that Speaker Denny Hastert and Tom Daschle, our majority leader, set just the right tone in what they said there on the steps of the Capitol. It was a bipartisan moment. It was a moment when the country was under attack. We needed calm, stern leadership, and we got it. And we were back in session the next day.
Senator Tom Daschle, your thoughts about that moment, that kumbaya moment, as members of Congress broke out singing God Bless America?
Well, I think, as I said a moment ago, Steve, I think the key, and Trent has alluded to this throughout the time we've been talking about it, is the need for leadership. We needed to prove to the country that we were up to the leadership required to respond to the threat, respond to the need for governance, respond to the anxiety that the majority, in fact, probably all of Americans were facing at the time. Terrible anxiety about where is all this leading, and are we still under threat, and how to restore some confidence and some degree of ability to demonstrate we're resilient and we're going to beat this. We're going to find a way to rise up and meet the challenges that are now presented to this country. And as Trent said, I think as a result of the kind of bipartisanship we were able to create, we got a lot of it done.
Program. Thank you on behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center for joining us. We want to turn to a consummate professional, author, and Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, seen frequently on a number of cable channels. Susan Page, thank you for moderating this part of the conversation.
Steve, thank you. Thank you so much. And our thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for this conversation. Doesn't it send chills up your spine to hear those firsthand accounts of that momentous day 20 years ago? And it's my privilege to have a conversation now with two people who know a lot about the threat to the Homeland today and moving forward. Jay Johnson, the former Homeland Security Secretary, and Phil Zelico, Executive Director of the 9/11 Commission. My thanks to you both for being with us. So it was 20 years ago, 9/11 happened. A few weeks after the attack, we were at war with Afghanistan. 48 hours ago, that war finally ended with the exit of the final U.S. forces. We asked in a USA Today poll last week, was the war in Afghanistan worth it? And Americans by close to 2-1 said, no, the war in Afghanistan was not worth it. We didn't define what worth it meant. Let me ask you, in terms of addressing and countering the terrorist threat that Afghanistan posed, was the war in Afghanistan worth it? And Secretary Johnson, maybe you could handle that first.
Susan, happy to take that on. First, I want to acknowledge the Bipartisan Policy Center. I thank you for the invitation. I accepted immediately when I was asked. I always look forward to having a bipartisan discussion of this nature. Before I go on with my answer, I do want to note I'm a New Yorker, and 20 years ago this month, 9/11 happens to be my birthday, and I was in this very same law firm 20 years ago on 9/11. Instead of being on the northwest corner of this building, I was in the southeast corner. I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan with my own eyes. I saw the buildings collapse with my own eyes. And as Senator Daschle said, it feels like it was just yesterday. It's vivid in my mind. My answer to the question was, I have a lot of thoughts on Afghanistan, obviously, including the conduct of that effort over the last 20 years and the last 3 weeks. But my answer to that is yes. Going into Afghanistan for its stated purposes at the time made it worth it. Over the last 20 years, through several administrations, Bush, Obama, Trump, we significantly degraded the ability of al-Qaeda to attack the homeland again. We significantly degraded the Islamic State's ability to attack Americans through our efforts in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. And I think it's important also to say the same thing to Gold Star families who are asking the same question, particularly those who became Gold Star families last week. It's never worth it to lose your son or your spouse, obviously on a very personal level, but the service that these brave men and women provided over the last 20 years, I believe, contributed to our overall ability to degrade overseas terrorist organizations to attack the continental United States again. Obviously, we found ourselves in Afghanistan taking on much more than the narrow mission of going after al-Qaeda, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But from where I sit, my homeland security perspective, going into Afghanistan to get al-Qaeda, to get bin Laden, and let's not forget all the other leaders of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State who were taken out through counterterrorism operations over the last 20 years in places like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. So my answer is yes. It was obviously costly, very costly. We ended up in a place where the Taliban is in charge again, but a lot has happened in that 20-year period that I think has made the homeland safer.
Phil Zelico, how would you answer that same question in terms of the goal of countering the terrorist threat to the United States? Was the war in Afghanistan worth it?
Well, the war in Afghanistan was part of a global war against violent Islamist extremism, and that war was largely successful. If you had told Senator Lott and Senator Daschle in September 2001 that we're going to launch a series of policies, and 20 years from now, those terrorists will not have organized another major attack on the United States in 20 years, they would have regarded that as the very upper boundary of possible success. And that's been achieved in part because of the public service that Secretary Johnson just alluded to. But if you come back to the question of, was the war in Afghanistan worth it? Therefore, part of it is, which war do we mean? Do we mean the war in which we went into Afghanistan to destroy the people who had attacked us? Yes. That was a war that Americans had to fight. In fact, Osama bin Laden had radically underestimated the determination and will of the United States to come across the other side of the world into the middle of Central Asia to come get him. And he did not underestimate it for very long. He became a hunted man until he was finally tracked down and killed 10 years ago. So then the question becomes, yes, but what about that other war? The war to help stabilize the new Afghan state. That's a much more difficult question to answer, but it's a different question. It was a different war. In my own personal view, I think that war could have, the American side of that war could have been wound up in the early 2010s after bin Laden had been killed. And actually a very good opportunity to wind it up was given to the Obama administration by Hamid Karzai, the leader of Afghanistan, who refused to sign a security agreement to continue our presence because he thought that Afghan nationalism required the United States to leave. I think we should have, at that time, in the early 2010s, have said yes to that offer for various reasons. And he never did sign that agreement, by the way, and neither did his successor. But for various reasons, which everyone understands, President Obama cut 90% of the troops. But as far as the rest went, we kept kicking the can down the road through administration after administration, trying to avoid the nightmarish images that everyone's just been watching during the last 2 weeks.
So I would also like to say that to those who are our audience, please feel free to submit your own questions if you'd like on the chat on Facebook or on YouTube or on Twitter with the hashtag BPC. What is the? I'm sorry. BPC Live, yes, with that hashtag, and we'll try to pose some questions from you. Whatever the wisdom of this war and its conclusion, let's talk about where we stand now. The Afghanistan Study Group, which has issued a series of reports, a bipartisan group, issued its final report in February. And it said then that the precipitous withdrawal of American troops could lead to a reconstitution of the terror threat to the US homeland within 18 months to 3 years. I wonder, do you think that's right? Do you share that concern, Jay Johnson?
I think the honest answer to the question is, and I say this without the ability to read daily intelligence reports anymore, I have to rely on the New York Times and Susan Page and others, and educated speculation. I think the honest answer to the question, what is the terrorist threat in Afghanistan now, given what has happened over the last several weeks, is it's too early to tell. The Taliban, there are elements of the Taliban that want to seem to behave like a government, though I'm quite sure that very soon we're going to see emerging factions of the Taliban, some moderate, some more militant, leading toward terrorists who are sympathetic to ISIS-K, though ISIS-K and the Taliban are sworn enemies on the surface. I think it is too early to tell. It's for some perspective here. We got into Afghanistan, and Congress authorized us to get into Afghanistan for purposes of going after AQ, and the Taliban was harboring AQ. And over the last 20 years, frankly, there have been a cascade of misjudgments. And I say that, though I was part of one of the 3 administrations over the last 20 years involved. I was at the table. I was general counsel of the Department of Defense before I was Secretary of Homeland Security. Hindsight is brilliant. If we were all had the benefit of hindsight, we'd be multi-billionaires right now. But we got into Afghanistan for purposes of taking out AQ and the Taliban. And then the advice is, well, if you want to take out the Taliban, you've got to prop up the Afghan government. You've got to prop up the other government. If you want to keep them in power, then you've got to help prop up a democracy. And sooner or later, we find ourselves in a counterinsurgency and what no one likes to acknowledge is nation building. And once you're in that situation, it's tough to then back away from it, because the advice is, if you take away any single part of this, the whole thing is going to collapse. And to his credit, President Biden said, I've seen this movie. I was at the table for 8 years as vice president. It's time for us to get out. Now, my view, and I've said this publicly several times, that we should have left in place a small footprint of a force, whether it's 2,500 or 22 or 28, for counterterrorism, intelligence collection, advisory purposes. You know, getting out doesn't necessarily mean every last member of the United States military has to leave. You know, you have, for example, Marines that protect embassies in almost every country in the world. And so that small force could do a lot for counterterrorism purposes in a place like Afghanistan. I do worry that Afghanistan is ripe for another caliphate, given that most of the space in Afghanistan is remote, ungoverned, mountainous, It is just the type of terrain that an ISIS-K or another wing of Al-Qaeda could rise again. And so we're going to have to be vigilant. It looks like we're going to have to be vigilant over the horizon, as we refer to it, but we're going to have to be vigilant in Afghanistan and all the other places in the world like Syria, Iraq, Horn of Africa, and Yemen.
Situation being ripe in Afghanistan at this point for a reconstitution of a terror threat to the United States, and how much more difficult is it to counter if you're doing it over the horizon, as Jay Johnson just said, rather than having military and diplomatic outposts there?
Like 8-year-old kids who all just follow the soccer ball. This is a global problem, okay? So if you ask yourself, where in the world are Islamist extremists gathering in the largest numbers, most danger to the United States and Western Europe, and the United States geopolitically is in the best position to do something about it? That list would probably be number 1, various places in the continent of Africa. Number 2, Syria and northern Iraq. Number 3, Arabian Peninsula. Afghanistan is way down the list. Why? Most important force in Afghanistan that's are extremists is the Islamic State Khorasan, or ISK. Now, Afghanistan is a country that is surrounded by every single neighboring country is hostile to a US presence. No exceptions. So any supply lines you want to run into Afghanistan have to run through territory of people who won't allow the United States to run through it. We ran our last supply line through Pakistan at the same time it was harboring the Taliban that were trying to overthrow Afghanistan. It's as if we were trying to fight the Viet Cong by running our supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through North Vietnam. I mean, it's just an absurd situation geopolitically. Now, let me also add, the Islamic State Khorasan is a bad group, really bad. But if we want to fight them, we need to get in line. The Taliban and the Islamic State are deadly enemies. The first thing the Taliban did when they got into Kabul, like right away, was run to the prison where the Afghans were holding a leader of the Islamic State Khorasan, so they could drag that guy out of his cell and shoot him in the courtyard 5 minutes later without ceremony. That tells you a little bit about their relationship. Not only do the Taliban regard the Islamic State as deadly enemies, so does every single other neighboring state. So in a way, like there are the Taliban and 6 other states in the region that want to kill those guys. Why does the United States need to have a base in the middle of Central Asia so that it can help, when there are other deadlier places all over the world? So my point to where I started was, it's important for the United States to take a global view of this problem, and also a global view of where it is we can make a constructive difference. And on that list, I don't think Afghanistan is going to be the soccer ball that we should be sure to chase.
Jay Johnson, Phil Zelico just listed places where he sees a bigger, modern, current day terror threat looming for the United States than Afghanistan. Where would you say the most worrisome hotspots are now that our policy really should be most focused on?
Well, to continue the sports metaphor, events in Afghanistan should not prevent us from taking our eye off the ball. In my view, the principal terrorist threat to our nation was 3 weeks ago and continues to be domestic-based violent extremism. The Anti-Defamation League has been tracking this now for years. Most terrorist attacks in this country do not come from foreign-based terrorist organization today. They come from domestic-based organizations. That threat has not gone away. It did not go away last week. So hotspot number 1, frankly, is when you're talking about threats to the American people, frankly, is here in our homeland, and domestic law enforcement needs to continue that focus. I think Phil is exactly right. We've got to keep our eye on the Horn of Africa. We've got to keep our eye on Iraq, Syria. We've got to keep our eye on Afghanistan and any other place where terrorist organizations could take root, and continue to be vigilant, not be distracted by the events of Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan create a new, very uncertain picture to add to the mix. But there are threats today, there are threats last month that continue. You know, in terms of security, broader security threats, we could talk about climate change, we could talk about cybersecurity. But in terms of the terrorist threat, I believe the number one source of that right now is domestic-based violent extremism, threats to the homeland.
In your very first, go ahead, Phil.
I just want to add that I agree with Secretary Johnson's assessment on that point. I think he's got that right.
I would just say that the first thing Jay Johnson said on this program was that if 20 years ago you had seen that there hadn't been another similar attack on the homeland, we would have been surprised 20 years ago. 20 years ago, if we were looking ahead, saying in 20 years, the bigger threat will be domestic terrorism, not foreign terrorism, I think that would have been shocking to a lot of Americans at that moment as well.
Well, the flip side of that, Susan, is that what you said earlier, what was the point that was made earlier? We've done a significant amount to degrade the ability of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State to launch a large-scale attack here on the homeland.
Yeah. Let's take some questions from the audience. Here's question one from Lorelei Kelly, who writes, I worked in Congress during 9/11. To my shock, Congress still lacks a continuity plan adapted for today's threats and risks. How do we get this to happen, not only documented, but implemented? I mean, it is true that Senator Daschle and Senator Lott account of this makes it sound like there wasn't a great plan for dealing with a situation like this 20 years ago. What about Lorelei Kelly's question? Phil Zelico?
Actually, I'll defer this one to the two senators or to Secretary Johnson. We did work, the 9/11 Commission worked very hard on continuity of government issues. Most of it is kind of a secret aspect of the Commission's work because we didn't wish to publicize the recommendations we were making. But I'll say that we concentrated mainly on continuity of government for the White House and the executive branch. And I don't feel like I'm expert enough on what work was done on this for the Congress.
Well, maybe we'll have
I will say that I too have been to the undisclosed location. I served as designated survivor not once, but twice. And I will tell you, Phil, that there is, in fact, a very elaborate continuity of government plan and regime on days when you need a designated survivor. But over to the two senators.
it's fine.
Will return to power in the continuity of government plan. There are secret folders they've been given. I hope that wasn't out of turn.
Well, you know, I think we saw the need for continuity government once again on January 6th, right? There continues to be situations where we worry about a disruption of the government. But I wonder, Senator Lott or Senator Daschle, do you think that enough has been done? Are you comfortable with the continuity of government plan that exists now?
Probably not, if I can jump in. We did have a number of meetings and hearings with security people. Where would members go? Where would they set up a meeting place? That has been determined. But I think, and we also talked about the line of succession. There was some concern about, president, vice president, speaker, where does it go from there? So we did have a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions. There are some plans in place, but I think it'd probably be a smart idea to revisit all of that in view of what we've been experiencing and what we see. It's not the kind of thing Congress likes to do because they're distracted over here trying to figure out how we do infrastructure and appropriations bill. But I think probably a little more work on that should occur.
Senator Daschle, what do you think? Do you feel we're in a pretty good place when it comes to continuity of government if there were another 9/11 sort of incident?
I think Trent is right. I would agree with what he just said. I think it is important for us to continue to review just how that mechanism would unfold and just what plans we have for continuity of government. I think that I also think that you have to separate the issues somewhat with regard to the leadership ranking and the kind of succession order that would occur in a continuity of government situation. But then also you've got to look at what are the threats. And I agree that the threats are vastly different in many respects than they were on 9/11. We haven't talked much about the anthrax attack 3 weeks after 9/11, but I don't think we've done a good enough job to prepare for a biologic threat, or some kind of a threat that could come with another massive anthrax attack over a stadium or a city or something like that. We do need to do a lot more to prepare for kind of the either the cyber attack or the bio attack that wasn't even in our consciousness 20 years ago.
Let's go to question number.
Just to give a little reassurance, there has been a good bit done in that. People don't really realize, but we used to have a meeting between the House and the Senate, and I worked with Ted Stevens when he was whipped, and I was whipped. That's when we agreed to put the bollards up around the Capitol. I tried to get a bulletproof glass to be put around the balconies. Remember, because we had some Puerto Ricans that shot into the floor of the House one time. I couldn't sell that, but the point I'm making is there's been more done in that area than we want to talk about that would address chemical or biological attacks. But I think also we need to pull that folder out regularly and take a look at it. Is it up to snuff? I remember one time I went to the Senate side of the Capitol and realized that there was only one policeman and 2 doormen, a man and a woman, between the front of the Capitol and the floor of the Senate. And that policeman had a pistol. And I went to Bob Byrd and said, say, Senator, do you realize how easy it would be to get in over here? But as a result of that, some other things have been done to give us a little bit more protection on the front side of the Capitol.
Yeah. Let's go to question number 2 from Virginia Bonney, who writes, Americans' trust in the intelligence community is critical to our national security policy. In recent years, the intelligence community has become more politicized. How do we restore the apolitical nature of the IC? Jay Johnson, are you concerned that the intelligence community has become politicized, taken on a more political cast than it used to have?
My sense is that we have returned to an intelligence community and senior level officials of the intelligence community who are not politically motivated. And I think that is so vital. I don't believe that there's any long-term trend to politicize the intelligence community. I think that some events over the last few years were hopefully atypical. I think it is fundamental that policymakers, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, can rely on the intelligence community for their clear picture. When I'd come to work every morning as secretary, literally the first thing I did before I even took my jacket off was to read the daily intelligence reports. And then if I had time later on, I'd read the newspapers to see how the Washington Post and the New York Times and the others were covering events that I knew to be reality. And when you're a senior official in Washington, intelligence community reports are really your eyes and ears and your flashlight for operating. And I think that I hope that there's been a return to normalcy in the last few months with the Biden administration. There'll be, questions asked about, why didn't we see the fall of the Afghan government collapsing so quickly? Those questions need to be asked, but my hope is that we've returned to an apolitical intelligence community.
Jay Johnson, when you would read the intelligence reports first and then read the news accounts, how close were they? Were they generally pretty on target, or were they often pretty far?
I once said to somebody when I was in office, the best question to ask, people would ask me, are we safe? And I'd say, well, the best question to ask somebody like me is how big a difference is there between what you know and what I know as a member of the public reading Susan Page or the Post or the Times. And sometimes it would be like this, and sometimes it would be like that. And so it depends, Susan. It ebbs and flows. But I believe that first and foremost, it's critical for the president, for those in national security, to use the intelligence community as their eyes and ears for doing their job.
Oh, Susan, if I could jump in, this is Trent again. One of the things that we did after 9/11 is we took a look at intelligence, and there was some recognition that maybe the CIA and the FBI and all our different intelligence groups were not talking to each other. And I think that led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the creation of the positions of DIA, Director of Intelligence, to help make sure that all of our different intelligence arms were communicating and talking to each other, not just staying in a compartmentalized limitation. And I think over the years that has worked in a positive way.
Philip Zelico, do you agree that the intelligence community is doing a pretty good job and not doing an apolitical job? And also, it's a separate question whether Americans believe that they're doing an apolitical job. If Americans believe they can trust what they hear from the intelligence community, what is your view on that?
Frankly, I'm taking a nonpartisan view on this. I think this situation got pretty bad in the last few years, both for the politicization of law enforcement and the administration of justice and into intelligence work. And we really trust that both law enforcement and intelligence work and the related intelligence efforts are pretty non-political. And I think there were some pretty grave dangers to that in the last few years. I think, to its credit, the Biden administration has tried conscientiously to put people in charge who are trying pretty hard to pull that back, in Merrick Garland, Avril Haines, Bill Burns, not exactly, none of them what you'd call partisan torchbearers. And I think that they're slowly trying to rebuild that sense of trust that these are fundamentally nonpartisan institutions, which is this. That doesn't mean they'll always do a great job, but it means they won't make their mistakes for partisan reasons. They just have been the challenges that all human beings face in doing a good job.
You said that there were times you felt there were grave dangers in the last few years when it came on the intelligence front. What were the grave dangers that you saw?
Well, let me just take, for example, an organization I know well, and which was a product of the 9/11 Commission, which is the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC. In some ways, I think it was the most successful bureaucratic innovation to come out of the 9/11 Commission report. Has worked, by the way, extremely well across both parties. It's an agency most Americans haven't heard of, but it actually is generally regarded as having been highly effective. The leadership of that particular agency got highly politicized during the last few years. They had difficulty getting a proper director. The very, very experienced people who'd been in charge of that were forced out for reasons that don't bear much scrutiny. And it became a political football in a way that had never happened before in the previous years since it was created in 2004. Since we're talking about counterterrorism, picking that agency out is a pretty good illustration of what I mean. And so you want to get something like that back, where an agency like that should not be a political football at all. There is a problem there in that they also do have to look at the problem of domestic violent extremism that Secretary Johnson talked about. But I don't think the issue of whether or not we want people attacking the U.S. Capitol should be a partisan issue. I think surely Senator Lott and Senator Daschle movingly spoke of how all members united against one possible attack on the Capitol that almost happened. I don't think it should be hard for members to unite again against another attack on the Capitol that did happen. But that's just my point of view.
Well, let's stick with the issue of partisanship and where we stand now. We have question 4 from James McCartan, who says, immediately following the attacks, the country was as united as it had ever been. 20 years later, surely nothing could be further from the truth. We heard the 2 senators talk about that. Jay Johnson, two things. What do you think would happen today on the partisan front if there were a day similar to 9/11? And how much difference does it make in terms of the overarching goal of keeping the country safe? How much difference does it make that we are now riven by partisanship?
Principal threats to our security, in my judgment, are global warming, cybersecurity, the threat of terrorism, and frankly, a partisan divided government with an inability to respond to those threats. I vividly recall, as I said before the program, after President Bush gave his post 9/11 speech, he stepped down off the lectern, and I remember he walked up to Tom Daschle, the Democrat, and gave him a big hug. If that happened today, the president of the opposite party, the Senate Majority Leader, probably be kicked out of leadership. And I recall being a New Yorker, the strong sense of national unity after the 9/11 attack, the flags that were draped over the highway overpasses and at homes, the national near unanimous consensus about what we needed to do in response to this, the levels of enlistment in our military that went up dramatically. When you compare that, frankly, to the response to COVID, which was a nationwide pandemic of the likes we had not seen in 100 years, and how attitudes toward the pandemic and the response to the pandemic have become a matter of partisanship. I do worry that if there were another large-scale terrorist attack on our nation, our government would have an inability to effectively respond in a manner that requires a lot of bipartisanship from our Congress and in our executive branch. I am very concerned about that.
Zelico, what do you think about that? Does it make a difference that our politics are now so divided? And if it does, if it's a dangerous thing, as Jay Johnson just said, what do we do about it?
Sure. I think it makes a big difference, of course. Right now, a group of foundations have asked me to lead an effort to plan a national COVID commission. And there's been some publicity about this, including an editorial in the Washington Post today praising this effort. And we've been working for months now with a large national group of experts from every walk of life to work on a national commission to deeply investigate what happened in this pandemic and learn lessons, inspired in part by the example of how the government came together to do this after 9/11. Right now, there's almost no chance that a bill to establish such a commission can pass the Congress. I've talked to members in both parties. The bills that have been proposed to do this are not getting any traction in either the House or the Senate because of the politics of the two-party caucuses and the way that the commissioners would be appointed by the congressional leaders is unsatisfactory to both parties right now. So Congress probably won't do it. The president doesn't want to do it right now. The best chance for such a commission to be created now will have to be if private foundations will sponsor an independent commission that perhaps congressional committees or the administration can facilitate and support. But I'm giving this as an example because if you look back on 9/11, one of the success stories, and in this period of depressing, failing news, we should think about a few success stories. The 9/11 Commission is a success story in a way. The country came together after a national trauma. It created a short-lived federal agency to understand what happened and why, and deliver an authoritative report, which it did, with the help of a lot of people, including the two senators who are featured today. That report then did a lot of useful, constructive things to help make the country stronger, safer, and wiser. So that's an example of what can happen when people work together. The test then is, can we do the same thing coming out of this pandemic crisis, which is the worst crisis perhaps the country has suffered since 1945. And right now, it's not clear we're going to pass that same sort of test. I hope we can, but that I think is a concrete example, Susan, of why divided government makes a difference.
All right, well, Philip Zelico, I know we all hope you great success in your effort to fashion a response and a better understanding of this COVID pandemic. I want to thank Philip Zelico and Jay Johnson for joining us with this conversation. And I want to go back to our two senators and give them just a moment to offer any final thoughts they might have. Senator Daschle, do you want to go first?
Sure, Susan. Let me just say how much I've appreciated the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. I've been so impressed with the eloquence of our special guests today. I think we all agree that sadly our nation has lost the remarkable unity that we felt on 9/11. We've all described it in various ways. And my hope is that somehow, some way, our leaders and our citizenry for that matter can find it in themselves to replicate the patriotism and the courage of the first responders and the medical staff and so many of the volunteers in the aftermath of 9/11 to restore the civility and the tolerance that our national unity so desperately requires. And it's really why the BPC exists, and in some ways why the organization now may be more important than ever. So I hope we keep doing these kinds of things. And thanks so much to you, especially for your efforts in making this such a success.
Senator Daschle, thank you. Senator Lott, do you have a final thought?
With three things. First of all, what goes around comes around. When we worked to try to help New York City after 9/11, a lot of senators and a lot of people appreciated it. Then when my state and Louisiana were hit by Hurricane Katrina, Senator Thad Cochran and I were trying to get some funds for Mississippi's recovery. And it was very close. I was losing some conservative Republicans because it was costly, but I was able to get Ted Kennedy, Chuck Schumer, and Hillary Clinton. And when the vote was over, Hillary was leaving the chamber, and I reached out and touched her on the arm and said, "Thank you for your vote, Hillary." She turned around and looked at me and she said, "You helped us after 9/11, and off she went. My message is this too shall pass. The last couple of years have been tough, with the pandemic and terrorism and the lack of bipartisanship, but it can change. And there's some basic things that need to occur. Tom Daschle says that the biggest problem in Washington is the airplane, because everybody wants to know what time can I leave Thursday night, and a little more time on the job would help. But there are going to be some men and some women that are going to step up in this government and in the Congress and say, we're going to get this job done. I hope it's soon.
All right, Senator Lott, thanks very much. And let me turn this back now to Steve Scully.
Susan Page, for your insightful and always thought-provoking questions. Thank you for adding your expertise to this really important conversation. We appreciate it, and good luck with your next project, including the Barbara Walters biography. I want to thank Phil Zelico, who's been joining us from the University of Virginia, and of course, Secretary Jay Johnson. I would be remiss if I didn't point out Crisis Point, the book by Senators Lott and Daschle, reflecting on what happened. So there's a plug for the book, Senator Daschle and Senator Lott. And a reminder that you can follow all of the coverage on the BPC website at bipartisanpolicy.org. And you can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. To all of you, to those who've been watching, we thank you.